Hello, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be having a look at some ship designs. Now, this will mostly be for more beginner players or returning players or people who are just interested in looking at some different ship designs. So it's more information, it's more a guide on what's good for the early, mid and late game, good against AI, good against the crises, or good against other players in PvP. Alright, so let's dive straight in and have a look at the ship designs. So early on in the game, you've got limited technology, and one of the best designs you can use is the Corvette, because it's nice and cheap. You've got access to the technology straight away, and it's not too hard to get other weapons. One of the first weapons you can get is disruptors. Now, it might take you a little while for the technology to appear. Disruptors, it's not a really early game tech, but it is in the early game, so you can get it. There are a couple different ways you can go about this. If you think someone's going to be using missiles against you, like the AI tends to use quite a few missiles in a lot of its designs, particularly early on. It likes them for some reason. You can use a mix like this, a couple disruptors and some point defense. If you're coming up against fighters, strike craft, you can always change it to a flak battery if you want to. I like to use the afterburner to give that extra speed so you can close the distance quickly. You got your level 2 armor. You'll use a swarm combat computer so that you swarm the target. And then just some standard technologies here. These are also you can use very early on. Now, if you wanted to, you could use a third slot and just have all disruptors like this, if that's what you wanted to. That can be useful early when you don't think you're going to be facing anyone who's using missiles or strike craft against you. And early on, 3 disruptors is very powerful, particularly against AI. In PvP, it can be a little bit more difficult because there are some counters to this, such as using destroyers with disruptors as well, and I'll show you that a little bit later. So using this early ship design is very powerful. It is relatively cheap, and you can build large numbers of these ships. And because you've got 100% shield penetration, 100% armor penetration, you're doing damage straight to the hull. And you might be able to get the level 2 disruptor, which is a nice significant upgrade. You can see there, does a fair bit more damage. So in the early game, this is one of the designs you want to use. Now, there is a proviso on this. When coming up against star bases, if the star base has a number of defense platforms, and the AI does like to build defense platforms, I wouldn't want to use large numbers of corvettes with disruptors, because you are going to take significant damage, particularly if it's a upgraded starbase level 2 with a handful of defense stations around it, particularly if it's a level 3 starbase, then it's going to, I wouldn't be using disruptors against it. You'd want to use, if you're going in with disruptors, you'd want to be using a frigate to go with you, something like this. Although it can take a little bit, well, you do get the access to the torpedo tech pretty early, but sometimes it can take a while to get the frigate technology to appear. So I would use something like this. The second weapon can be anything you really like. You can throw in plasma or kinetic batteries, whatever you prefer, lasers. I like disruptors because you're going through the hull to shields and armor and doing damage to the hull. And that's very good for space torpedoes because they do multiplicative damage against the starbase. Up to 800%, I believe, is the maximum against the starbase. So you can multiply that damage by, I think it's 8 from memory. I could be wrong, it could be 7. But it's 7 or 8 times, so you're doing a massive amount of damage. The only thing with frigates is they are slow, so you want to use afterburners. And the AI, or the combat system in Stellaris, does tend to target frigates first. So if there is an opposing enemy fleet, you want to send your corvettes in first, and then your frigates coming in behind, so that at least the corvettes can run interference and screen for your frigates. So if as long as you've got some of these, you've got to get them in close enough. They do lots of damage and they'll help you deal with the star bases. Or you can opt for another type of corvette, a mix of lasers and kinetic. You can add a combination of what you want. You can even add in some early plasma if you wanted to, just to mix it up. And corvettes like this will make easy work of a starbase if you've got it in enough numbers. So you can have a fleet of these and then a fleet of your disruptor corvettes if you're taking on a starbase. You can use a early destroyer. If someone is using lots of disruptor corvettes against you, this would be more in a PvP setting. You can use a destroyer like this. Disruptor destroyer with double afterburners and all armor, and these settings, picket computer, will beat a corvette swarm due to the superior hull points. There's just a lot more hull points in a destroyer than there is a corvette, provided you've got roughly equal numbers of ships. Like the corvettes will outnumber you 2 or 3 to 1, but as long as you've got rough equal in terms of you've spent roughly the same alloys as your enemy has spent. If your enemy has you vastly outnumbered in corvettes because they've spent far more alloys, then you're going to be, nothing's really going to stop you. You've lost the game anyway because you've been outspent in alloys on a large scale. The only thing you can do is fall back to a starbase, have defense platforms, and I would have defense platforms. I'll do a quick look. We've got lots of ship designs here. My star bases would be something like, my defense platforms would be something like this. If you're versing corvettes, just take out all of this. For armor, you put level 2 armor in here. Actually, regenerative hull is a pretty good one for defense stations. If you happen to get it, you can get that quite early in the game as well. Seems to appear quite often, so that's not a bad one. 5% daily hull regen and 10% daily armor regen. You can put double ones of those in. So you can either do strikecraft and go for that to help with thinning out the numbers of corvettes, because strikecraft are really good against corvettes. They deal with them very, very effectively. Or you can go with an option such as medium weapons is what I would use, and I would use a mix of lasers and kinetic. If you got level 2, you got level 3, just plunk in all the armor, something like that. You'd obviously have different power levels, but a medium station with medium lasers, medium kinetic, a defense station, you add a few of these into your starbase can make it a lot stronger, so that you're not just got strikecraft, you've also got some other weapons here which are tearing into them. And depending on if your enemy is a player or AI, you want to go over a mix of weapons. Against a player, you'd probably have mostly anti-armor weapons, but just be careful because some players will stack shields as well, just because they know people are going anti-armor weapons. So they'll go more shields to counteract that. And that's simply because if you are new to the game, armor, you can see here, level 2 armor is 321 armor points, whereas your level 2 shields offers 250 shield points versus 325, but you do have 1.6 daily regen, but often the battle is long over before you've equaled out in terms of points spent versus the points spent here. So you do you use more power and less alloys to equip shields, spend more alloys to equip the armor, but you get actual more hit points right there from the first day. All right, let's move on to some strategies for the mid-game. Now, the mid-game, you can still be using corvettes, disruptor corvettes, if you wanted to. That's sort of an end game. That's end game still. Let's have a look. You'd have something like this, adding some extra armor. You'd probably have level 2. You probably wouldn't have that yet. And advanced. So probably by about the mid-game, you can have corvettes like this if you wanted to. Probably haven't got level 4. It's probably going to be level 3. You can elect to have a third disruptor, depending on what you're fighting against. If it's against humans, it depends who you're fighting, because there is a good, once you get the cruisers, a good missile build as well. So if you have your heart set on using corvettes, by the mid-game you do want to include most of your corvette fleets with either flak or a PD, because people are going to use strikecraft and missiles against you for sure. So just be careful of that if you're still using corvettes. I don't tend to use corvettes too much once in the mid-game. I tend to have them mostly to use as a fleet to take the alpha shots. And what I mean by that is I will have a couple fleets of corvettes. They will go in first into the system where I'm going to be fighting, or engage the enemy first in front of my other fleets, so that they take the biggest shots from the enemy, because the evasion on corvettes is the highest. So you've got the highest chance for the enemy to miss its most powerful shots, and they're wasting them on your corvettes, while your bigger ships are further back and their weapons are engaging their capital ships from further out. And hopefully your enemy, it doesn't have many corvettes screening their fleets to take the alpha shot. So you can use it in that way, so that corvettes absorb most of the damage, leaving your larger, more expensive ships free to fight another day. Now in the mid game, you're probably going to be using some destroyer fleets if you wanted to. The only type of fleet I would use in the mid game would be for destroyers, disruptor destroyers. Same with the corvettes, just a little bit upgraded from what you were using in the early part of the game. Something along these lines. Leave it at level 2. Upgrade that to advanced. Something along these lines. They could be quite effective. But in the mid game, most players will go for cruisers because of their versatility. It just depends with the changes in the tech that have occurred in the recent months. Sometimes you might be a long period of time before you reach cruisers, depending on how you're going technology wise and the RNG role as well. So there could be a period of time where you are stuck using destroyers. You can also opt for another build as well. If you don't want to go with disruptors because you've got to get really close, you can opt for a missile build as well if you've got the technology. You could use swarmer missiles in the medium slots, and we could say use level 3 missiles in the small slots, and got double afterburners. It's pretty much the same, except you want to be going with an artillery computer, and this is why destroyers are good, because you can use the artillery computer. On corvettes you can't, so this will force them to stay at maximum range and fire off their missiles, and they'll tend to kite the enemy around. So this is another strong design for the mid game, and it's one of the few designs I would use for destroyers, either disruptors to get up close in the face or corvettes to stay at extended range. And this is probably one of the better designs, I would think, for destroyers. But I don't tend to use them too much, destroyers these days, unless it's the combat corvettes. Now cruisers, this is going to be your main mid-game weapons. I'll just see if I can find one. Yep, this is a missile cruiser. This is a very strong design. It's one of the strong metas for the cruisers. It's one of them, it's not the only one. So I probably have advanced combat computers by this stage of the game. That's carrier. There we go, put that in. Probably have, yeah, level 2, it's fine. Now the whirlwind missiles have 100% shield penetration, so they're going to go straight for any shields and do damage to armor and the hull. So they're pretty effective. They got long range, 100 targeting range, or retargeting range I should say. Range is 120, so it just means that their retargeting range is very long. So if the ship they've targeted is destroyed while in flight, they will retarget, meaning that pretty much every missile is going to hit a target unless it just basically misses the tracking. And they do have 100% accuracy and 30% tracking, so they are a very effective weapon to use. So this is a pretty good design. With the double afterburners, they'll stay at max range and kite around and just keep firing at the enemy fleets. So it is a good weapon to use. Very, very effective. The other weapon, which is probably more effective than the missile cruiser, just beats it by a little bit, is a disruptor cruiser. Probably want the double afterburners by this stage. So this cruiser is just, with disruptors, is just so powerful because it's got so much hull points, and you can equip it with a lot of armor. I've got one shield in there as well. One little trick you can do is, if you have shields, one shield and armor, your enemy can't see how much shields and armor you've got unless they've got really, really high intel on you. So they don't know whether you're running, just by looking from the galactic map or the system map, they can't see if you've got 1,000 shields or 100 shields. They can't tell if you've got one shield on there. So sometimes it's good just to have one shield in there to deceive your enemy if you're playing against other people. Only problem with this, you got to get nice and close. So you got to get the close speed, but this will destroy most other cruiser designs. I say most because there are a number of strong designs, but this will obliterate destroyer fleets, obliterate corvette fleets. So it's very powerful. This is going to beat pretty much any AI fleet you come up against. It's not going to, and same with the missile corvettes, they'll beat nearly any AI fleet you come up against. The only way this design is a little bit weaker is against star bases, but if you've got enough cruisers, they're going to kill it because the cruisers have got so much hull points, armor, that's very hard to kill them. Cruisers also have a higher disengagement chance as well, so you can get them back after battle a lot of the time. And if you've got some leaders which complement that, that'd be fantastic. Let's have a look at another design which is very effective. The carrier cruiser is also a pretty good design, pretty good against corvettes actually, because you've got the strike craft and you've got the missiles. So you can change this to flak batteries or point defense depending on what you're fighting against, missiles or enemy strike craft perhaps. So it's quite a very flexible design. It's not too bad if you just want to use strike craft and missiles. So something along those lines is pretty good just for a standard carrier. Let's have a look at these are probably this one. This is another good mid-game cruiser. This is extremely powerful because you've got 3 lots of torpedoes which do multiplicative damage against the enemy. So if your fire is facing off against other cruisers and battleships, this is really, really good. The only thing is you have to close the range to use them. Does have tier 5 armor. Let's drop that down a bit. We'd probably have at least tier 3 by this stage. Let's just drop that down and we'll make it advanced torpedoes. That's all right. We'll leave that. That's all fine. The other thing you can do with this, because we do have to close with range, there's 2 theories here. Because you're starting on a long distance away from the enemy, you can either fire missiles as you're closing the distance, so your missiles are firing and doing damage until you get into range of the armored torpedoes, or you could change these to disruptors, so that as you're firing torpedoes at close range, which is probably going to be where a majority of the battle is fought, you're using your disruptors which do shield penetration and armor penetration, so they're going straight to the hull and complementing the torpedoes and doing lots of damage. So just depends what you prefer. I would probably opt for disruptors with using torpedoes because it's just simply more powerful, I believe, because the cruisers are going to stay at closer range with this type of combat computer so that your torpedoes can do as much damage as possible. So it gives option for your disruptors to be constantly in the fight all the time, doing lots of damage direct to the hull and killing the enemy ships. So that's quite powerful. I'll just save that one actually. So that's a powerful design if you prefer. It's also good against other multiplayers. Now they're probably the 3 or so cruiser, 3 or 4 cruiser designs that you're going to use in the mid game. And cruisers make up the bulk of the fighting in the mid game. If you're going to be using against, whether you're fighting against AI or human opponents, that's what it is. People are aiming to get to cruisers because they are the most versatile ship in the game, meaning you can change the weapons pretty quickly and relatively cheaply to suit whoever you're fighting against. You can change from torpedoes, you might want to change into or missile build, or different slots depending on the circumstances that you're fighting. You can even switch these into, you can all go smaller slots if you needed to, which we've got here to fight smaller corvettes and destroyers, or you can go for the larger slot weapons and the L slot weapons. You can make, say, a kinetic battery or artillery cruiser if that's what you wanted. So it's a very versatile. In the late game, you can use corvettes in the late game, and the way I would use them is something like this or this. These fleets, as I said, would just be to screen your main battleship and cruiser fleets. You'd have, 2 or 3 of these fleets, maybe more, maybe 4, depends who you're fighting against. These type of fleets will run interference, take the alpha shot from the enemy, close into range and just swarm the enemy fleet. They'll just be flying constantly around enemy fleets, firing their disruptors, and hopefully the enemy fleets are targeting them first and trying to kill them. And with the much higher evasion, a lot of their shots will be missing, so they're wasting their shots while your cruisers and battleships are destroying the enemy fleet from longer range. So these are the type of designs I would use in the late game. Have a couple of these fleets, and to give you a perfect example, an enemy that has a couple of these fleets, and I've done this in multiplayer, if I had, say, 2 or 3 of these corvette fleets, and then I've got my battleship fleets and cruiser fleets behind them, I will beat the opponent every single time if they don't have corvettes to counter my corvettes, or a specific design, say like a destroyer design to come and counter my corvettes. They will lose every single battle because the corvettes will just decimate them by tanking the alpha shot, swarming them, while my main fleets just obliterate them from range. It's a very powerful combination, having corvettes screen your cruiser and battleship fleets. The only thing is I would not use these ships against a crisis. They just, crises, particularly when you're doing let's say 10 times crisis and higher, they just do too much damage because you're dealing with millions of fleet power. It just becomes so costly replacing thousands of corvettes because you have to constantly rebuild your fleets. When you're fighting a crisis, and it becomes a numbers game and alloys, and per alloy for firepower, corvettes are quite expensive compared to cruisers and battleships. In the late game, I wouldn't really be worrying about destroyers too much, except there is one design which I do like, which is this artillery destroyer. You can use lots of destroyers quite cheaply with artillery, because you can use the artillery combat computer like you could with the missiles, and you also got some missiles you can use at long range as well. They're just going to pepper away at your enemy. So these can be quite good if you want a cheap artillery ship to complement your other fleets. It can be something to throw in a spanner in the works of your opponent using a design like this. That's something that you can do. You can also use a disruptor destroyer if you don't like to use corvettes, if you just want less numbers of ships to be able to replace and something a little bit more sturdy. These are probably a little bit better to use against crisis as well. They still have quite high evasion at 61% there, and you can easily get that up higher. I don't even have any leaders or anything to really min-max this up to the highest level. That's just your standard evasion levels with the tech that I've got, which is pretty much all the tech. So that's pretty much the only sort of designs I'd probably be interested in using on destroyers in the mid to late game. This is another destroyer design that I would a cruiser design I would use in the late game, a mix of devastator torpedoes and level 3 disruptors, which is just utterly brutal, this type of combination. I do use this design against crises. This sort of becomes my charging fleet to do maximum damage. They do tend to lose quite a few of the ships, but at 893 alloys, they're not too expensive to replace, so you can replace them quite quickly, and the build time's not too bad. So they'll close in torpedo range and do massive damage against the crisis fleets. That's what it's intended to do anyway, or against AI or human opponents. This is a very effective design, very powerful. You can also use missile cruisers as well, just updated from our sort of mid-game technology, just a bit better weapons, very effective. Once again, they'll stay at long range and just pepper away. I don't tend to use missile cruisers so much against the crisis fleets. I tend to use the torpedoes, simply because they do much more damage, that burst damage, which is what you need against the crisis fleets. You need that high DPS to get through and destroy their actual ships. This is fine against human opponents and AI opponents. No problem at all. A very, very powerful design. They'll just keep at range and kite the enemy around and pepper them away with missiles. That's just a pure disruptor cruiser. If you don't want to run with torpedoes and just want to use your disruptors, it does take less power requirement because your torpedoes do use a lot of power. You can see here the power usage is 34 per each, whereas the disruptors are half of that. So it's a lot more energy efficient if power is a problem. Strong design, very effective. I would just prefer to use the combination of this because this is very good against pretty much everything: battleships, cruisers, stations, crisis, everything it's good against. Now, carrier cruisers, I always like these as well. Probably not so much against the crisis, but this is sort of a mid-late game against the AI and other human opponents. This is a pretty good design. It's got a good mix of either PD, or you can mix it with flak as well. Have a flak battery in it as well to deal with enemy strike craft, missiles, whirlwind missiles. Another effective design, you're using the carrier combat computer so you can stay even further away from range, and you can use the strike craft to really hurt your enemy. Very good if your enemy is using corvettes as well. So if the enemy is doing the trick you're doing to having screening fleets, carrier cruisers can be very effective to help deal with fleets of corvettes. This is another variation of the torpedo cruiser, except you've got the energy neutron launchers. So this version of your ship will stay at long range. You fire off the neutron launchers and the Marauder missiles, so you don't have to close to close range. So you can probably, this design would be more survivable against certain crises because you can stay at longer range and pepper away at the enemy fleets. It just depends what crisis you're fighting against, and I'll go through that towards the end of this video. Now, this is another really effective design. This is probably if not the strongest cruiser design. It would either be the top or the second. It is very, very strong. It's the best overall combination that you can probably find with a cruiser design, because you've got a mix of torpedoes, which do huge amounts of damage. You got good range with your missiles, doing constant damage as soon as you basically enter the fight. And you've got your strike craft as well, which will fly in and do damage to enemy fleets of all sizes. So this will protect you against small fleets. The missiles will be good against corvettes and all sizes of ships, and your torpedoes are great against cruisers and battleships. So you can pretty much deal with any type of fleet you may come against. So this is an extremely versatile design, and you can put your armor and shields any way you like, of what you prefer. They're using the artillery combat computer, 3 afterburners. That's why you've got the 2 small slots here on the gunship stern, because it gives you 3 lots of auxiliary slots instead of the 1 with the instead of 2 with the medium. So it gives you your ship far more speed to kite the enemy. Now the only problem with this design is the range of the Devastator missiles. So you're pretty only going to use these when the enemy closes the close range, which can be a problem if the enemy is staying at range, which will be you're not using your full firepower of the fleet. So you can change to use a neutron launcher depending on the enemy you're using, or if you do want to close and use your main weapon, just change it to using the torpedo combat computer. So it depends on the situation that you're facing and what you want to do. But this is overall the most versatile design. Like if you use a torpedo combat computer on, you're going to be using all your weapons. These ships will charge in, close the max range. They're firing off everything from long range anyway as soon as they're entering the fight, and then they're going to try and obliterate them with this and chuck in, say, if your enemy's got strike craft, chuck in a flak battery, and you are really, really good. This is, in my opinion, one of the best designs. This would probably be number 1 for me, with either disruptors, which one would I have? You'd either have this one is very, very powerful as well. This would probably be number 2 in my opinion. It's just this one, the all-round cruiser, is just very versatile. That's in my opinion. This is another mid-game cruiser you can use. I call it a bit of a meta cruiser. It's just like our top one up here, just like this, except it's a mid-game. I think I showed it before, but that's very, very powerful. Another excellent design. Now for the battleships, you can't really go past the good old artillery battleship. Now you can use either all artillery like this, or you can throw in a X-slot. Now what X-slot weapon you use is up to you, depending on the circumstances. The X-slot Giga Cannons does a lot of damage to shields. The Tachyon Lancers will do damage to energy armor, or armor-based weapons. If you got the focused arc emitters, they go through shields and armor and do damage directly to the hull, but they have a lot higher, a lot variable chance of the damage. There you can see there does 2 to 1690, but I primarily use the focused arc emitter. In my opinion, it's one of the best, and when I've tested all of these L-slot weapons, the focused arc emitter generally comes out on top in most circumstances. So you can slot that in to complement your kinetic batteries. These are just pure DPS. These do some of the highest damage and DPS in the game. They constantly fire at a pretty rapid rate, long range, and do a lot of spike damage, and particularly against enemies with shields. But I tend to use them even against enemies that have armor. I don't tend to swap out the artillery batteries. I just leave them there to do pure DPS. I tend to swap around the X-slot weapon instead. If it's someone who's stacked a lot of armor, then slot in the Tachyon Lance instead, and you're going to have lots of battleships doing extra damage to the armor, and this will destroy any shields I've got, and then start working on the armor and hull once you've broken through the armor, and this will help bust through that armor and do damage to the hull as well. And you obviously want to start artillery range. If you have a bit of speed as well, that can really help keep your fleets at maximum range away from the enemy fleets. Now you've got your carrier battleship as well, and you can have a couple different designs here. You can either use 2 lots of strike craft and keep the fleet at long range using missiles to complement the strike craft and fire away. You can either have your choice of spinal mount weapon, X-slot weapon, or you can change it into another carrier core or hangar bow and have 3 lots of strike craft if that's what you prefer. It's really up to you. I tend to go for the X-slot weapon so that I can do damage at long range, and it can really contribute to the battle even if you're staying out at range, because with just the strike craft and the missiles staying at range, you're not doing a huge amounts of high DPS in a fight like against crisis fleets or these really large battles where you've got, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of fleet power fighting. You want that high spike damage from your X-slot weapons firing at that longer range as well. So I tend to use the X-slot weapons, but if you're not up against those type of enemies, you're fighting just AI fleets, you might want to go with lots of strike craft and have the 3rd strike craft, because they do lots of damage to those smaller fleets of corvettes and destroyers, and AI tend to have quite a few of those even up into the late game, so designs like this can really help you. So my main battleship designs, I tend to stick with 2 battleship designs mostly. I'll mostly have something like this, where I'll change out the X-slot weapons and I'll mix around with the armor and shields depending on who I'm fighting against. And then I'll have a artillery battleship design. Probably I'll have mostly armor in here, and I'll just change around the X-slot weapon to whatever I need. Sometimes I'll have combinations. I'll have maybe 3 or 4 fleets with the Tachyon Lance, and then I might have 3 or 4 fleets battleships with a focused arc emitter, and just to switch them around. And then I might have fleets with a few more shields, just to mix it up so your enemy can't get the perfect counter to your fleet. If you can don't be lazy and have multiple ship designs for that same ship class and have a few fleets in each, a bit of a mix, it makes it a lot harder for your enemy to counter you and beat you easily in a battle. So I tend to produce these ship numbers quite high numbers. With the battleships, there is an argument to be made that cruisers are the most versatile ship in the game, cost-wise, in terms of alloys and their flexibility. Me personally, I like to have battleships and cruisers in the late game. They tend to be my mainstay, with a number of corvette fleets running the screening fleets, taking the alpha shots for those main fleets, using them ahead of my main fleets, which is really good. In terms of Titans, one of the best things about Titans, particularly against crises, is the shield dampener, minus 20%. That can really help you versus the crisis. Try to make multiple ship designs. You can have ship designs, your Titans, for each of these aura abilities. Probably the main ones you want. You probably don't really need to worry about subspace snare as much versus crises, but these other ones can be really effective. So I tend to have 1 design each, and if I've got 10 fleets, I'm going to have 1 Titan of a different design with a different shield dampener in each fleet, so that I'm getting the most out of my auras to help my fleets to try and reduce the firepower or increase my own firepower for my fleets. I tend to take artillery batteries just to keep the Titans at range and fire away, and the Peridition beam to fire at maximum range. Of course, you might have the relics, which then you could use this weapon. This is a really effective weapon to use on a Titan, because you don't tend to replace them very often, the Titans. Hopefully you don't lose too many, but you can see here, for the cost of spending some relics, the damage 5 to 10,000. That is 5 to 10,000. But then look at the armor bonus, plus 75% armor and 25% hull damage. So you're getting another 25% damage output bonus compared to the Peridition beam. Also look at the rate of fire, the cooldown, 14.5 versus 25.5. It's almost, not quite double, but it's probably like 75% the more fire rate from this than the Peridition beam. So do you think it's worth spending 40 relics on each Titan to upgrade to this weapon? Accuracy the same. The range is a lot less. That's the only problem. It's at basically the same as artillery range, which I don't think is an issue, because you want to be at 120 range anyway, so your artillery batteries are firing, and then you've got your Peridition beam or your ancient ruination glare in there to provide a lot more firepower for your enemy, much higher fire rate. If you've got your Titans firing at twice the rate, doing some spike damage like this, that might be enough to tip the battle in your favor. Plus all your different auras, so keep that in mind. Now for the crises, so I'll just go through this a little bit. The Scourge, Rithorian Scourge, they're mostly going to come at you with ships that have no shields and are high in armor. So your ships want to focus on weapons that do either spike damage to armor, like your Tachyon Lance, so that will do a lot of damage to your armor and hull. You want to be focusing on weapons, just seeing if I had some Cloud Lightning here. Cloud Lightning is not too bad against enemies that have high shields and high armor, but against the Rithorian Scourge, you've got lots of options to get through that armor. You can either use lasers, pop them in there if you want to. I tend to keep using artillery. For me, I prefer just to keep my battleships and artillery, and I tend to just change around. The main slot weapon. Against Rithorian, do not use Giga Cannon. Giga Cannon's good against shields. You're either going to use the focused arc emitter, because it does 100% shield, 100% armor penetration. It'll go straight through the armor of the Rithorian ships and hit the hull. But you don't know how much damage it's going to do, because it does 2 to 1690, whereas the Tachyon Lance does a lot more damage, or guaranteed damage, because it starts at 780, and it does 100% armor damage and 50% hull damage. So these things will rip through the Rithorian ships at a lot better rate. Now the Rithorians use missiles and strike craft, so you're going to want to have fleets that have point defense and flak, and this is where your carrier battleships or your cruiser battleships are really beneficial, because as you can see, you can have point defenses and flak batteries, plus you got the strike craft to go and engage the enemy strike craft, and their strike craft are powerful, and their Scourge missiles are very powerful. So you want to make sure you got point defenses to try and intercept those missiles. So, and the cruisers, the carrier cruiser, because your cruisers will be in front of your battleships, they can help screen your battleships as well. And one of the good things about having a couple of Corvette fleets to go in against the Scourge is having a design something like this. You might have one fleet like this with, say, 200 Corvettes or 180, whatever it is your fleet capacity is. So they go in and do max damage to the enemy fleet, going through their hull, and also they'll be intercepting missiles, and your other fleet, you might put in a flak battery so that they really hammer those strike craft before they even leave the vicinity of where they're launched from, or they intercept them midway between the crisis fleets and your main fleet. So the Corvettes do come in handy, certainly against the Scourge with these type of ships, but just be prepared, you're going to lose a great deal of them to the Scourge once you close into range. Because they are using missiles and strike craft, you want to have anything which will boost up your shield penetration or armor penetration. You're not going to be having probably too many shields on your ships, so you probably want to boost up your armor penetration. So things like your Genius Armorer on your leaders, on your council, if you can get a few of them during the game, that can add a lot of percentage to your armor and shield penetration defenses. So I can't remember if it's 20% or 25% for a Genius Armor. I just can't remember off the top of my head, but it's one or two of those. So you're even going to get 40 or 50% bonus. I think it's 40% if you've got 2 Genius Armorers. If you happen to get 3, well, that's 60%. So that 60% armor reduction, armor penetration reduction. So if you can put on your armor hardening on your ships, plus you've got 3 Genius Armorers, well, you're at 85% armor hardening, which means you're going to reduce a lot of the incoming damage from the enemy's strike craft or missiles. If any bypass weapons, they can be really effective against the Unbidden as well. And we'll go into that in a minute. Unbidden are an energy-based crisis, so you want mostly anti-shields. You want basically artillery battleships and anything which will knock down an enemy's shields quickly. So in this case, the Giga Cannon is very effective against the Unbidden. Kinetic artillery, missiles, anything that will bypass the shields, even disruptors, because they're going through the shields and doing damage. to the Unbidden's hull. Now, arc emitters as well. I just love arc emitters. The arc emitters are my favorite X-slot weapon. They do the most damage average overall out of all the X-slot weapons. And I've done some quite extensive testing on that and some videos a fair while back now, last year, on the X-slot weapons. So that's also good against the Unbidden. You're going to want to use more shields versus Unbidden on your ships. So you don't. This is one of the cases where if you've got all armor, you've been using mostly armor throughout the game, against the Unbidden, you're going to have to spend a lot of time upgrading your ships to mostly shields and things that will boost your shield on your ships, your total shield capacity. So you might want to think about having shield capacitors, things like that, to boost up your use of shields, because they are mostly energy weapons, and energy weapons are mostly anti-armor weapons. So if you have high shields, that's the highest bonuses you're going to get versus energy weapons, because they've got negative modifiers to get through those shields first before they get to your armor and then hull. So that's why shields are the most important. Now, the Unbidden have very low range of their weapons. They don't have long range weapons like you have with the focused emitters or X-slot weapons. So if you use speed and stay at a distance with your larger ships, you can do a lot of damage to the Unbidden before they even reach you. A lot of their weapons are shorter ranged. So if you're sending in your corvettes at close range, you might want to change their computers or keep them out the battle. You might just want to use your cruisers and battleships staying at longer range and using afterburners to stay at that longer range versus the Unbidden, because they are a bit slower. They do have short range weapons, and you can do a lot of damage prior to the enemy fleet reaching you. So that's really, really important with the Unbidden. For the contingency, they use stronger shields and armor, so, and they have a very fragile hull. So the problem with them is you need to get through both shields and armor. And what's a great weapon for going through shields and armor? Focused arc emitters, disruptors, great for going through them. So this is where your corvettes can be very effective as well, because they're going to be doing direct damage straight to the enemy's hull, which in the case of the contingency is very fragile. So we probably want the late game disruptor cruisers. You can have something like that, or you can still be using the devastator torpedoes as well. Something like that is pretty much perfect against the contingency. So any weapons which will go through armor and shields, or your bypass weapons, missiles, because they do partially go through there, torpedoes obviously because they partially go through, but they go through shields, they do a lot of damage extra to armor, and any weapons that would bypass the shields and do bonus damage to armor to get to that hull quicker is going to be a lot better for you. Now the contingency does have, on the ships, they've got poor tracking. So if you have ships with higher evasion, if you can boost your evasion, the contingency has a harder time hitting them, and this is where the corvettes come in really handy. So swarms of corvettes are a real problem for the contingency. They have a hard time dealing with that because their weapons are focused more on longer range. So if you have got your two fleets dueling at each other, it can be a real problem because you're slugging it out at the contingency's strength at longer range weapons. So if you get cruisers like this and you set them to come in at torpedo range, really close, high speed, so you're getting higher evasion, though the evasion is not too high on a cruiser, but you're coming in doing lots of damage. The contingency has a harder time dealing with that, particularly if you're going to be using corvettes and coming in. But the corvettes simply, they don't do a lot of damage, but they will do enough damage to harass the enemy. And maybe the corvettes, because the contingency has poor tracking and they're trying to hit the closest ships probably to them, which are the corvettes, they're going to miss a lot of times, wasting a lot of their shots, where your fleets at longer range of battleships and cruisers can pepper away and destroy the contingency at long range. Your carriers are also very effective against the contingency because of the strike craft and their ability to go through shields and do damage directly to the armor. So that's very effective as well. Something else to consider is using your archaeo technologies. If you've got lots, you can consider using them. Like, here's an archaeo battleship. It'd be like I call it like a silver bullet fleet, like your elite forces. That, because you don't have the relics to constantly replace them in battles of crises, but you could have a few elite forces, if you like, of archaeo battleships, I like to call them. I'll probably only spend it on battleships because cruisers you're probably going to lose them more. But they do offer more damage, more firepower to get through and destroy the enemy fleets. So you can see here, look at this 100% shield penetration, 100% armor penetration, 25% hull damage. Just really, really good. They just do small amounts of damage, but high fire rate, and they go through everything pretty much to hit the hull, and they're doing bonus damage to the hull as well. There's standard whirlwind missiles, but you've got point defenses as well, which are superior to standard point defenses. If you're lucky enough, you can get nanite flak batteries as well. If you happen to get the nanites in the L cluster, or if you got equipment to build that, it's only 13 alloys, so that's a good flak defense. If you, particularly against the Scourge, that'd be a really good one to use. So don't discount using archaeotech weapons. But the only problem you run into, if you're fighting, say, 25 times Crisis, you're going to be losing so many ships, and you're going to have to be replacing them so quickly that I wouldn't be using this type of design or any design with dark matter, because you're just going to run through, you just got too much of it. Or just you might have these in your elite forces that you're holding back, or you might use in the first few battles just to try and really knock the Crisis back. But then after that, you have to switch to your standard ships and just replace them, because you just want ships which have pretty much mostly alloys and standard resources. Like this one's artillery battleship, it's fine, just costs strategic resources and standard alloys. So consider that when you are fighting the Crisis, that you need a high production, and you have limited amounts of those rare resources. Even if you have large stockpiles, you tend to use them out pretty quickly. The last thing against a contingency is, like the Unbidden, you want to use shields, as their weapons are mostly energy-based weapons, so they will be doing more damage to armor. So just keep that in the back of your mind. So with the contingency, use more shields on your ships, not armor, less armor, so more shields. So just keep that in the back of your mind when fighting the contingency. So you can see if you've got mostly armor on your ships, when you have to fight the Crisis, you really have to switch it around and put in your shields. And if you happen to be psionic, using some psionic shields, PSI drives and things like that, that can be really, really beneficial as well. And psionic is one of the stronger builds at the moment. What do you call it? Cheaters of the Shroud. Yeah, so we call it Cheaters of the Shroud, not Teachers of the Shroud, because it is very, very, very powerful. So hopefully that gives you some idea of what you need to build, some of the ship designs, so that you can progress through the game a lot easier. Give you some ideas on how to fight the Crisis and some ship designs. And like a lot of testing, I've done a lot of testing over the years. A lot of these designs have been proven to be very, very strong, very effective. In some situations they lose out, but in most situations these designs will win most of the time. And you will see that in a lot of the multiplayer games if you watch any of the tournaments and things like that as well. Alright, that's it for today, guys. It's just a guide. So if you enjoyed that video, hit that like button for me, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye for now.